Spring, 255 BTC. The Bagradas River Valley, a flat corridor of farmland southwest of Carthage, in what is now northern Tunisia. No hills, no forest, no broken ground, just open plain running toward the sea, and across it, marching in tight formation, an army that had not lost a battle in over a year. The men were Roman. Their commander was a consul named Marcus Atilius Regulus, and by every measure available to him, the war was already won. His fleet had crushed the Carthaginian navy the previous summer. His legions had landed in Africa, taken town after town, and beaten a Carthaginian field army so badly at a place called Adys that Carthage itself had opened peace negotiations. Regulus was not marching to fight for survival. He was marching to collect a surrender. He had roughly 15,000 infantry, some 500 cavalry, and the most sophisticated infantry system in the Mediterranean world behind him. Waiting for him on that plain was an army he had already beaten once, same city, same soldiers, same elephants. By early afternoon, his army no longer existed. The overwhelming majority of those 15,000 men were dead or captured. Regulus himself was in chains, and the man who did it to him was not Carthaginian at all, he was a Greek. A professional soldier from Sparta, hired for pay, who had stepped off a ship only months earlier and had never before commanded a Carthaginian army in his life. His name was Xanthippus, and the question that has followed this battle for over 2,000 years is a simple one. How does a single hired foreigner take a broken, demoralized army, an army that had just lost to these exact same Romans, and use it to erase a consular army in a single morning on the same ground against the same commander? The answer is not that he found better soldiers. He used the ones Carthage already had. The answer is a blueprint, and one piece of that blueprint, one decision made by Regulus himself in the final hour before contact, is the piece historians still argue about. We will get to it. Here is what this story will give you before it ends. First, the one structural weakness buried inside the Roman manipular legion, a system so flexible it would eventually conquer the Mediterranean, and yet a system with a blind spot that Xanthippus read within weeks of arriving. Second, the peace deal Carthage very nearly signed the winter before the battle, and the single Roman demand that killed the negotiation and forced this fight to happen at all. Third, the exact arrangement Xanthippus built on the plain, close to 100 war elephants, 4,000 horsemen, and a Greek-style phalanx, each placed for one specific job. Fourth, the decision Regulus made as the two armies closed, a formation change that looked prudent in the moment and instead sealed the destruction of his army. And fifth, the strange, mismatched fates of the two commanders afterward, because one of them became one of the most famous legends in Roman history, and the other, the man who actually won, vanished from the record within a year. One note on how we know any of this. Nearly everything comes down to us through Polybius, the Greek historian writing in the 2nd century BC, and modern scholarship on the First Punic War treats him as the principal surviving account of this conflict. He is careful, he is close to the events, but he is one voice, and where later Roman tradition decorated this story, and it did, we will say so plainly. To understand the plain at Bagradas, you have to understand the year that led Regulus onto it. In 256 BC, the First Punic War was entering its 9th year. Rome and Carthage had been grinding against each other over Sicily, and Rome decided to end the stalemate by doing something it had never attempted, carrying the war to Africa itself. A massive Roman fleet met the Carthaginian navy off Cape Ecnomus, on the southern coast of Sicily, in one of the largest naval battles of the ancient world, and the Romans won. The road to Africa was open. 2 consuls made the crossing. One was recalled to Rome with part of the force. The other, Marcus Atilius Regulus, stayed through the winter with the remaining army, roughly 15,000 infantry and 500 horsemen. Regulus was a serious man by reputation, a farmer senator of the old style, and the Oxford Classical Dictionary records him as consul twice, in 267 and again in 256. He was competent, aggressive, and, by the end of that first African campaign, entirely convinced of his own momentum. He had reason to be. Late in 256, near the town of Adys, a Carthaginian army came out to stop him, and its commanders made a choice that will matter enormously in a moment. They camped on high, broken ground. Rough terrain felt safe. But high ground is exactly where cavalry cannot charge and elephants cannot deploy, which means the Carthaginians had marched out with the two arms in which they held a crushing advantage and then chosen ground that switched both of them off. The Romans stormed the position and shattered them. Carthage panicked. The city's territory was being burned, its subject towns were defecting, and by winter its leaders had opened negotiations. This is the part of the story that gets skipped, and it should not be, because the battle at Bagradas was avoidable. Carthage was prepared to make peace. Regulus, sitting in Africa with a victorious army and a consulship about to expire, wanted the credit for ending the war himself, and so he set his terms. And the terms were not a negotiation. They were closer to an erasure, conditions so severe that accepting them would have reduced Carthage to a dependent of Rome in everything but name. The Carthaginian council refused. Polybius frames their reasoning simply, that men with anything left to fight with will choose to suffer anything rather than accept that. The negotiation died, and with it, Regulus's easy ending. And that same winter, ships arrived from Greece carrying hired soldiers because Carthage, a maritime empire built on wealth rather than a native mass army, had always recruited its wars. Among the new arrivals was a Spartan officer named Xanthippus, a man trained in the Spartan military tradition, the most respected school of soldiering in the Greek world. The Oxford Classical Dictionary lists him simply as a Spartan mercenary commander of the 3rd century BT. He held no rank in Carthage. He commanded nothing. He was one hired man among thousands. Which brings us to the mechanism at the heart of this story, because to see what Xanthippus saw, you first have to understand the machine Regulus was marching, and why it was so hard to beat. The Roman army of this period fought in what is called the manipular legion, and a 2020 study in the journal Historia traces how this system evolved through the early Republic into something genuinely unusual for its time. Instead of one solid block of spearmen, the Greek model, the Romans broke their infantry into small units called maniples, 120 men or so, arranged in 3 successive lines with gaps between the units, like squares on a checkerboard. Younger troops in front, veterans behind. When the first line tired, it could filter back through the gaps and be replaced by fresh men. The formation could bend around obstacles, fight on broken ground, absorb a failed assault, and simply feed in the next line. Against infantry, it was ruthless. It had beaten the Carthaginians at Adys precisely because rough terrain, the kind of ground that wrecks a rigid phalanx, barely inconvenienced it. But the system had a dependency, and it is a quiet one. The maniples could do all of this, rotate, flex, reform, only as long as nothing was pressing their flanks and rear. The legion's cavalry existed to guarantee that protection, and Roman cavalry was the weakest arm of the entire system. Small in number and modest in quality, Regulus had 500 horsemen in Africa. 500, to screen the flanks of 15,000 men. On rough ground it didn't matter because terrain did the screening for him. Hills and gullies are a kind of armor. Xanthippus's insight, and Polybius presents it as almost offhand. A professional's glance at another man's work was that the Carthaginians had not been losing because their army was worse. They had been losing because their generals kept surrendering the one thing that made their army better. Carthage had 4,000 cavalry and around 100 elephants, and its commanders kept hugging hills, terrified of Roman infantry, and in doing so they were switching off their own advantages and fighting Rome's kind of battle on Rome's terms. His diagnosis, as the tradition preserves it, was blunt. Carthage was being beaten not by the Romans but by its own choice of ground. The remedy was almost insultingly simple. Come down onto the plain, fight where horses can run. Word of the Greeks' talk reached the Carthaginian command, and in their desperation, they did something proud states almost never do. They handed effective command of the army to a foreign hired officer. Xanthippus drilled the army outside the city walls, Greek-style, maneuvers by trumpet call, units learning to move as one body, and Polybius records that the mood of the army turned. Soldiers who had been beaten men in the autumn were by spring asking to be let out. When Regulus's army approached down the Bagradas Valley, burning as it came, Xanthippus led the Carthaginians out to meet it, and he stopped on flat, open ground and offered battle there. Regulus accepted. Understand why? Because it is not stupidity. He had beaten this army months earlier. Refusing battle in front of a recovering enemy, with his consulship expiring and a successor perhaps arriving to harvest his war, was politically unthinkable, and no Roman army in living memory had reason to fear a Carthaginian one in the open field. Every instinct he had, personal, political, professional, said advance. Now look at what was actually waiting for him, because the Carthaginian deployment that morning was not a line of troops. It was an argument, and every piece of it had one job. The first piece was the elephant's green. Xanthippus took the elephants, Polybius says close to 100 of them, and instead of scattering them along the army or holding them in reserve, he placed them in a single line across the entire front, ahead of everything else. A wall of animals, each one several tons, spaced across the axis of the Roman advance. A 2020 academic study devoted specifically to Xanthippus and his elephants at this battle stresses how deliberate this employment was. The elephants were not there to win the battle. They were there to break the shape of the Roman formation before the real battle started, to force the maniples to compress, bunch, and lose the spacing that made their whole rotation system work. An elephant line is a formation-wrecking instrument, and Xanthippus aimed it at the one army in the world whose strength lived entirely in its formation. The second piece stood behind the elephants at a measured distance. The Carthaginian citizen infantry, arrayed as a phalanx, a deep, ordered block of spearmen. Its job was patience. Whatever came through the elephant line, disordered, winded, thinned, would arrive not at open ground, but at a fresh wall of spears. The mercenary infantry, including the Greeks, took position toward the right. Nothing about the infantry plan required brilliance. It required only that the infantry still be standing, in order, when the Romans reached them, because the decision would happen elsewhere. The third piece was the wings, and the wings were the actual weapon. 4,000 cavalry, split between the two flanks, facing Regulus's 500. This is where the plain stops being scenery and becomes the trap itself. On flat ground, with a numerical advantage of 8-1, the Carthaginian horse did not need to fight for victory on the wings. Victory there was arithmetic. The real question was only what the cavalry would do with the 10 open minutes that arithmetic would buy them, and Xanthippus had already answered it. They would not chase fleeing horsemen off the field, the classic squandering of a cavalry victory. They would turn inward. Elephants to break the Roman shape, a phalanx to hold the Roman weight, cavalry to close the Roman exits, each arm doing the one thing it did best, sequenced so that each created the conditions for the next. Later military writing would give this a name, combined arms. On that morning, it had no name. It was simply a professional using every tool in the box at once, against an opponent who had, in effect, only one tool. And Regulus, looking across the plain at the elephant line, made his decision, the one we flagged at the start. He changed his formation. We will come back to exactly what he did, because it is the hinge of the entire battle. What matters first is the sequence, because once the two armies moved, the destruction unfolded with a speed that shocked even the victors. The battle opened on the wings, and it opened fast. The Carthaginian cavalry came forward on both flanks, and the 500 Roman horsemen, outnumbered 8-1 on ground built for horses, were swept away almost on contact. Polybius passes over it in barely a sentence because there was barely anything to describe. Within minutes of the first charge, the Roman army had no flanks. Every man in the legions was now standing inside a box whose sides had just dissolved, though in the dust and noise, very few of them could have known it yet. In the center, the elephant line went in. Picture it from inside a maniple, a wall of animals coming on its speed, the ground carrying the vibration before the sound arrives. This was the moment the Roman formation change was supposed to answer. And along most of the front, the line did not break and run, which tells you something about the discipline of these men. The elephants plowed into the forward maniples, and the fighting became a churning, compressed mass, ranks driven into ranks, the careful checkerboard grinding into a crowd. Some maniples were trampled under, others let the animals pass through the lanes and pushed on beyond them, bloodied but moving, straight toward the waiting Carthaginian phalanx. And on the Roman left, the plan actually cracked. Roughly 2,000 legionaries on that wing struck the mercenary infantry opposite them, broke them, and drove them back in flight toward the Carthaginian camp. For a few minutes, if you stood on that part of the field, the battle looked like Adys all over again, Roman infantry doing what Roman infantry did. Hold that image, those 2,000 men punching clean through the edge of the trap, because they matter to how this day ends. But in the center, the men who had fought through the elephants arrived at the phalanx, and this is where the sequencing showed its teeth. They arrived disordered, exhausted, and thinned, exactly as designed, and they met fresh, ordered spearmen who had not yet fought at all. The Roman assault ground to a halt against the spear wall, and at that precise moment, the Carthaginian cavalry came back, not chasing anyone, turning inward, as instructed, into the exposed Roman flanks and rear. That was the battle. Legionaries in the front ranks were pressed against a phalanx they could not break, while the ranks behind them were struck from behind by cavalry, while elephants still moved through the crush. The manipular system, the rotation, the relief lines, the flexibility, all of it requires space and a secure rear, and the Romans now had neither. Polybius describes men trampled by the animals, men cut down where they stood in ranks too compressed to fight. It was not a defeat in the way Adys had been a defeat, a beaten army streaming away. On a flat plain with cavalry holding every exit, there was nowhere to stream to. It was an enclosure of the entire army that left wing detachment. The roughly 2,000 who had broken the mercenaries and momentum had carried out past the edge of the killing zone, cut their way clear, and eventually reached the coastal town of Adys, where the Roman fleet could take them off. They were, in effect, the only organized survivors. Regulus himself was taken alive, a Roman consul in Carthaginian chains, along with about 500 men around him. Nearly everyone else, 12,000 or more, died on the plain. The Carthaginian losses were, by comparison, trivial. From first cavalry contact to the end, the battle had taken part of a morning. Now, the decision, the one Regulus made in the final hour, the one historians still turn over. When Regulus saw the elephant line, he did not refuse battle, and he did not thin his front. He did the opposite. He deepened it, stacking his maniples many ranks deep, packing more men behind fewer frontages, on the logic that a deep column of infantry can absorb an elephant charge the way a cushion absorbs a blow. Read one way, it is sound, and along much of the front it did in fact keep the line from disintegrating under the animals. But every rank added in depth is frontage given up in width, and every yard of width given up made his line shorter, easier to overlap, easier to envelop, against an enemy whose entire design was envelopment. Regulus arranged his army to survive the weapon he could see, the elephants, and in doing so he shaped it perfectly for the weapon that actually killed it, the cavalry. That is what makes Bagradas such a steady battle, the recognition that Regulus was not passive. He identified a threat, adapted intelligently to it, and his adaptation was the final component the trap needed. Modern analysis of the battle points to exactly this interaction. The elephant screen forcing a formation choice, and the formation choice speeding the envelopment. Xanthippus did not simply beat Regulus. He got Regulus to finish building the trap himself. Which leaves the two men, and the strangest part of the story, because the field of Bagradas treated them almost exactly opposite to what you would expect. Regulus, the loser, became immortal. He was held prisoner in Carthage, and around his captivity Roman tradition grew one of its most cherished legends that he was sent to Rome on parole to argue for peace, instead urged the Senate to keep fighting, and then, because he had given his word to return, walked back to Carthage and to execution. It is a magnificent story of Roman honor. It is also, in the judgment of most modern scholars, largely or wholly a later embellishment, a moral fable Rome told about itself, growing over the bones of a plainer fact that Regulus died in Carthaginian captivity. The Oxford Classical Dictionary treats the famous embassy with exactly that caution. Rome could not undo the defeat, so it did something more durable. It rewrote the defeated man as the hero. And Xanthippus, the winner, the mercenary who had saved Carthage from extinction in a single morning, disappears. Polybius tells us he left Carthage not long after the victory and remarks that the decision was a wise one, a pointed comment on how safe it was to be a foreigner who had just outshone every general in a proud city. Later writers spun darker endings, including a tale that the Carthaginians, unwilling to owe their survival to a hired Greek, put him on a ship rigged to sink. Most scholars read that as legend too. What the record actually gives us is simpler and stranger. A man who authored one of the most complete tactical victories of the ancient world, collected his pay, sailed away, and left history almost nothing else. No later command we can verify, no statue, barely a life outside that one morning on the plain. The war itself did not end at Bagradas. It ran on another 14 years, and Rome in the end won it at sea. But something on that plain left a permanent mark, because Roman commanders in Sicily spent years afterward visibly unwilling to offer battle in open country wherever elephants were present, edging along hills, declining ground they would once have taken without a thought. One defeat had taught the most confident military culture in the Mediterranean to fear a battlefield, and the deeper lesson traveled even further than the fear. Carthage's army before Xanthippus and Carthage's army at Bagradas were the same men, the same horses, the same animals. Nothing material changed in those few months. What changed was where the army stood and how its pieces were sequenced, and that alone was the difference between an army that kept losing and an army that annihilated a consular legion before midday. That is the blueprint, and it is worth stating plainly because it outlived everyone in this story. Strength is not a possession. Strength is a match between what your force does well and the ground it is standing on, and the moment those two things separate, numbers and reputation and momentum stop protecting you. Regulus marched onto the Bagradas Plain with the better infantry, the better record, and the winning side of the war, and none of it mattered, because every one of those advantages had been quietly disconnected by an enemy who chose the ground, chose the sequence, and let Regulus supply the final mistake himself. The most dangerous man in a war is rarely the one with the biggest army. It is the one who has correctly understood what the ground will and will not allow, and arranged for his enemy to discover at last. If this kind of story is why you are here, the overlooked morning that bent a whole war, the professional who saw what everyone else missed, then subscribe and turn on notifications, because that is what this channel does every week, and alike genuinely helps these longer histories find the people who want them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next battlefield.